The first war between humanity and the Vakari was never supposed to happen. When Earth's first deep space fleet reached beyond the edges of the solar system, they found a galaxy already carved into empires, alliances, and rivalries stretching back millennia. Humanity was a newcomer, an unknown variable in an ancient cosmic equation. And to the Vakari Dominion, they were little more than pests, primitive, reckless, and expandable. The war began without warning. Vakari warships, sleek and jagged like blades of obsidian, descended upon human colonies, obliterating them before any proper defense could be mustered. Earth and its fledgling spacefaring nations scrambled to respond. But against an empire, with thousands of years of warfare ingrained into its culture, humanity was hopelessly outmatched. The Vakari were not mindless conquerors. They were a warrior species bound by an ironclad code of dominance. To them, strength was the only currency that mattered. Weakness was a disease, and humanity, fragile, untested, and technologically inferior, was unworthy of survival. For 2 decades, Earth burned. Millions perished as colony after colony fell. The United Nations of Earth, once an organization of diplomacy, was forced to become something else, an engine of war, forging reluctant nations into an unyielding resistance. But humans had something. The Vakari did not expect adaptability. They fought in ways the Vakari could not comprehend. When a planet was lost, human forces did not surrender. They vanished into the depths of space, striking from the shadows. When a Vakari warlord claimed victory, their supply lines would suddenly disappear, their warships sabotaged by human engineers who had long since been presumed dead. The war was brutal, relentless, and costly for both sides. The Vakari learned that humans, though physically weaker, were tactically unpredictable, resourceful, and, above all, stubborn beyond reason. Then came the breaking of Draconis faith, the battle that changed everything. The Vakari, tired of prolonged resistance, unleashed their final solution, a planet-cracking weapon designed to wipe Earth from existence. But humanity, in a desperate act, launched a suicidal assault on the Vakari command ship before it could fire. The battle was chaos, humans and Vakari clashing in the void, ships exploding in fiery wreckage, bodies floating lifelessly among the stars. In the end, the unthinkable happened. The weapon was destroyed, the warlord leading the invasion was killed, and the Vakari Dominion, out of respect for their fallen leader, offered an uneasy truce. For the first time in history, humanity had survived a war against a superior alien force, but the scars ran deep. Humanity would never trust the Vakari, and the Vakari, though forced to acknowledge humanity's strength, would never see them as equals. The war was over, but the real battle had yet to begin. For decades after the war, a fragile peace held between humanity and the Vakari Dominion. Though neither side truly forgave the other, they both understood a simple, unspoken truth. Another war would be too costly. Humanity, scarred but unbroken, rebuilt from the ashes. Earth itself had barely survived the conflict, its cities forever, marked by the orbital bombardments that had nearly wiped them out. But humans were nothing if not resilient. The same ingenuity that had allowed them to fight against the superior Vakari war machine now drove them forward. Their fleets grew stronger. Their technology advanced. Their presence in the galaxy expanded. The Vakari watched from a distance, wary of their former prey. They had dismissed humans as weak once before, and it had nearly cost them everything. Their warlords debated endlessly. Should the Dominions strike before humanity became a true rival? Or should they simply allow them to grow, hoping that the scars of war would keep them in check? Neither choice mattered in the end, because something else had already begun. It started on the edges of known space. Isolated colonies, trade routes, and military outposts simply went silent. No distress signals, no wreckage, no survivors. The Ari galactic community, accustomed to the occasional pirate raid or rogue faction, dismissed the disappearances at first. But as the pattern spread, system by system, planet by planet, fear took hold. The first real encounter came when a Vakari patrol fleet was sent to investigate the loss of communication with a mining world near the border of their empire. The fleet arrived to find the planet dark, its once thriving settlements reduced to lifeless husks. No bodies, no signs of battle, just silence. Then the scanners picked up movement. At first, they believed it was a trick. Sensor ghosts, radiation, interference, anything but what they were actually seeing. But when the shadows detached from the darkness of space and moved with terrifying coordination, they understood. The fleet never sent a warning. No one escaped. Word spread slowly, whispered between terrified captains and scattered survivors who had seen the horror firsthand. The attacks were not random. They were systematic. An intelligence lurked behind them, cold and calculating. And it was growing. The enemy finally revealed itself over the world of Rigel 7, a human Vakari trading post on the fringes of civilized space. The distress call that reached Earth and the Dominion was brief, an image of the sky darkened by the silhouettes of countless unknown vessels. The final transmission from the planet's surface was a single whispered word from a dying officer. Eidolon. They were not an empire, not an army, not conquerors. They were the end. Humanity and the Vakari had spent decades preparing for the wrong war. Now, they would either stand together or be erased from history. The meeting should never have happened. The war had ended in blood and fire, leaving humanity and the Vakari locked in a fragile ceasefire built more on exhaustion than trust. Even after decades of uneasy peace, they still watched each other from the shadows of their respective empires, waiting for the moment that old wounds would reopen. Yet now, they were both dying. The Eidolon had made sure of that. For all their centuries of war and conquest, the Vakari had never faced an enemy like this. The Dominion's fleets, once an unstoppable force that had crushed entire civilizations beneath their heel, had been shattered across dozens of star systems. Warlords who had once spoken in arrogance now whispered in fear, their forces reduced to scattered remnants, fighting for survival rather than victory. Humanity fared no better. The outer colonies were gone. Entire worlds that had taken generations to build had vanished into the endless night, their populations consumed by an enemy that offered no surrender, no terms, no possibility of negotiation. The ships that returned from these battles were haunted things, their crews speaking in hushed broken voices of an enemy that moved with perfect mechanical precision. There was no strategy to defeat them, no diplomacy to be had. There was only the slow, inevitable march of extinction. It was the Vakari who broke first. Their high command, once too proud to acknowledge any weakness, sent a transmission unlike any they had ever sent before. An admission of desperation, a request for a meeting, a plea for help. The humans did not respond immediately. They could have ignored it. Let the Vakari burn as vengeance for the war that had nearly wiped them out. Let them stand alone against the horror clawing at the edges of known space. But the Eidolon would not stop with the Dominion. And so, after weeks of deliberation, the answer was given. The location was chosen carefully. Neutral ground, a barren moon orbiting the ruined remnants of what had once been a thriving colony world before the Eidolon had found it. There was no sound in the vacuum of space, yet somehow the silence felt deeper here, heavier, as if the very void itself was holding its breath. On one side of the chamber stood the human delegation, their officers clad in the sharp, dark uniforms of the United Earth Fleet. Their expressions were unreadable, but their postures spoke volumes. They did not trust their former enemies. The Vakari mirrored them on the opposite side, towering, armored figures whose very presence radiated tension. Their species had been bred for war, built to command and conquer, but now they stood with the same quiet uncertainty as the humans. The idea of asking for aid, especially from those they had once sought to exterminate, was an insult to everything they had believed in for centuries. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of history. Then, finally, the Vakari High Warlord spoke. His voice was low, steady, but beneath it was something that no human had ever heard from a Vakari leader before. Fear. We cannot defeat them alone. The words hung in the air, impossible, yet undeniable. The human admiral across from him, an older man with the hard, weary eyes of someone who had seen too many wars, narrowed his gaze. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the alien in front of him. the same way one might study a weapon that had once been pointed at their throat. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "If we agree to this," the Admiral said, his voice cold and precise, "you don't give the orders. We do." Murmurs rippled through the Vakari delegation, low growls of displeasure. This was not what they had expected, but the High Warlord merely exhaled, long and slow. The choice was clear. They could fight and die as proud warriors, alone in the darkness, or they could follow. And maybe, just maybe, they could survive. The war between humanity and the Vakari had ended long ago. Now, for the first time, they would fight as one. But trust was still a fragile thing, and war had a way of breaking what was fragile. The air inside the war room was thick with tension, the kind that weighed on the bones and made every breath feel heavier. The chamber itself was built into the heart of the massive human battleship Indomitable, a relic of the last war that had once fought against the very beings now standing inside it. The walls hummed with the quiet pulse of energy shields and reinforced plating, as if the ship itself was listening, waiting, uncertain of what was to come. The Vakari warlords had never set foot inside a human vessel before. To them, these ships had always been prey, things to be destroyed, scavenged, and left drifting as lifeless husks. But now, they stood as guests, or perhaps something less than that, allies in name only, held in a place where every corridor, every guard, every unseen weapon system reminded them that this was not their domain. The humans had positioned themselves carefully around the table at the center of the room, a display of holographic maps floating above its surface. The Vakari delegation mirrored them on the opposite side, their massive forms armored in the same battle-forged plating that had once been worn in conquest against these same people. They loomed over their human counterparts, their golden eyes unreadable, their expressions betraying nothing. A human officer leaned forward, fingers tapping against the table as he studied the projections. His uniform bore the insignia of the United Earth Fleet, but it was the scars on his hands and the sharp lines of exhaustion on his face that spoke the loudest. He had fought in the last war. He had seen firsthand what the Vakari had done to his people. The silence stretched long before he finally spoke. "The Eidolon are advancing faster than we predicted." His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it, an unspoken understanding that they were running out of time. "Every colony they take, every fleet they destroy, they're adapting. Their attacks are becoming more coordinated, their response time shorter. This isn't just a mindless swarm, there's intelligence behind it." Across the table, the Vakari High Warlord watched him without blinking. His name was Varun Ka, though among his kind, names were less important than the battles one had survived. He had been born for war, shaped by it, tempered in the endless cycle of conquest and victory that had defined his people for centuries. Yet now, that cycle had been broken. He exhaled, slow and measured. "We have faced the Eidolon in open battle 5 times, he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried the weight of those failures. "Each time, we underestimated them. We assumed that sheer strength and superior firepower would be enough." He leaned forward slightly, golden eyes narrowing. "We were wrong." There was no pride in the admission, no attempt to soften the reality of what had happened. The Vakari had spent centuries believing in their own superiority, and in a matter of weeks, that belief had been shattered. The human admiral, a man named Gideon Rains, studied the alien across from him. He had fought against the Vakari when he was younger, had watched friends die screaming as their warships tore through Earth's fleets with ruthless efficiency. That was the only version of them he had ever known. Merciless, relentless, unyielding. And now, they looked different. Not weaker. Never weaker. But there was something else there now. Something that had never existed before. Desperation. Rains reached forward and adjusted the projection, shifting the map to highlight a system on the outer edges of what had once been Vakari-controlled space. "We lost contact with New Horizon 3 days ago," he said. "It was one of our last remaining strongholds in the sector. We sent a recon team to investigate." He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "They didn't return. The room darkened as a flickering transmission appeared in the center of the table. The image was shaky, distorted. The face of a young officer, barely visible through the static. Her voice cut in and out, her breathing heavy, her eyes wide with something that looked like barely contained panic. Don't know how. The transmission glitched. They're inside. More distortion. Then, a sharp, ear-piercing screech, and, finally, silence. The projection cut out. The room remained dark for several seconds before the overhead lighting flickered back to life. A heavy stillness settled over them. One of the younger Vakari warriors exhaled sharply, his mandibles clicking together in a gesture that, among their kind, signified unease. "What is this?" he demanded. "This is not the way they have fought before." "They're learning," Rains said simply. Varenka's expression remained unreadable. "Then we must learn faster." The Admiral nodded once. "We launch a counteroffensive," he said. "We retake New Horizon. If there are survivors, we bring them back. If not—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They all understood what that meant. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Varenka straightened, his massive form casting a long shadow over the table. He turned to the warriors at his side, and when he spoke, it was not in the language of diplomacy, but in the hardened, commanding voice of a warlord who had once led legions into battle. "We fight." The room erupted into movement. Orders were issued. Battle plans were drawn. Ships prepared for war. There was no trust between them, not yet. Perhaps not ever. But war did not wait for trust. And for the first time in history, humans and Vakari would go into battle together, not as enemies, but as something else. The fleet moved like a spear through the void, its vanguard cutting through the darkness of space with silent determination. The combined armada of humanity and the Vakari Dominion was an uneasy thing, a patchwork of ships that had once been designed to destroy one another, now forced to fly in formation toward a common enemy. On the bridge of the Indomitable, Admiral Gideon Rains stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze locked on the distant glow of New Horizon's star. The colony itself was not yet visible, but the silence surrounding it was deafening. There were no hails, no automated beacons, no signs of life. The planet had gone dark, and every instinct in his body told him that whatever had taken it was still there, waiting. Behind him, the Vakari High Warlord Varenka stood just as still. His golden eyes narrowed as he studied the vast emptiness ahead of them. His people were not accustomed to this kind of warfare. Battles fought in shadows, against an enemy that did not announce its presence with honor, but instead struck from the unseen. To the Vakari, war was a song of strength, sung through the clash of steel and the roar of battle cries. But this was not war as they knew it. This was something else. A low chime sounded through the bridge. One of the officers at the sensor station turned, her face tight with unease. "We're picking up faint energy signatures near the colony," she said. "Minimal movement. Could be debris. Could be—" She hesitated. "Could be something else." Rains didn't need her to finish. He already knew. "Bring us in slow," he ordered. Weapons primed, shields at full. The ships adjusted their course, moving cautiously toward the lifeless world below. The first sign of what had happened to New Horizon came as soon as they crossed into low orbit. The planet's surface was wrong. Where there had once been sprawling settlements, industrial zones and farmland, there was now only ruin. Not just destruction, this was something far worse. The cities had been stripped bare, their skeletal remains standing like the bones of some long-dead beast. There were no fires, no wreckage, no bodies. Everything was simply gone. Rains exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening behind his back. "No signs of battle," he murmured. "No craters, no weapons fire." Varenka's mandibles clicked, together softly. "This is what they do," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was something beneath it, an anger that simmered, barely contained. "They do not conquer. They do not leave trophies. They consume." A silence settled over the bridge. Then, a new signal flared across the sensors. Movement. Rains reacted instantly. "Full scan," he ordered. Are they ships? Ground forces? What are we looking at? The officer at the console paled. Admiral, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're already here. The view from the forward display adjusted, enhancing the image of the darkened colony below. And then they saw them. Not ships, not ground forces, something in between. The Eidolon did not operate like conventional fleets. They did not rely on hulls of steel or engines of fire. Instead, they moved as if they were part of the void itself. Shapes that blurred at the edges, figures that did not reflect light in a way that made sense. They clung to the ruined cities like shadows given form, waiting, watching. And now, they had noticed the fleet above. One by one, they began to move. The first attack came without warning. A burst of impossible motion. A ripple in the blackness of space, as an Eidolon form detached from the ruins below and hurled itself toward one of the forward Vakari warships. There was no energy signature, no engine flare, no heat, just the absence of everything, closing the distance faster than the eye could follow. The ship's point defense turrets reacted too late. The thing struck the vessel's hull, and in an instant the warship simply folded. There was no explosion, no debris. One moment, the massive warship was there. The next, it was collapsing inward, its structure twisting into itself like paper, crumpling in an unseen fist. Then it was gone, not destroyed, not shattered, erased. A horrified silence filled the bridge. Then, the alarm screamed. "They're coming!" someone shouted. And they were. From the ruins of New Horizon, the shadows rose, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They did not move like ships, did not fly like any fleet known to the galaxy. They swam through the void as if it were water, slipping through reality with effortless grace. The Vakari warlords bellowed orders in their native tongue, their warships igniting their weapons with savage fury. The humans did the same, fleets shifting into attack formations as railguns charged and missile bays locked onto the advancing enemy. Rains didn't wait. There was no time. All ships, fire at will. The first barrage tore through the blackness, a wall of plasma, kinetic slugs, and beam weaponry lancing out toward the encroaching tide. The void burned as explosions erupted among the Eidolon ranks. Some were torn apart, vanishing into spirals of darkness. Others took the hits and simply kept coming. The battle began in full. And for the first time in history, humanity and the Vakari stood side by side, not as enemies, not as conquerors, but as the last defense against an enemy neither of them truly understood. The war for survival had begun. The void ignited. Beams of plasma cut through the blackness. Tracer rounds streaked across the battlefield like burning stars, and missiles left contrails of fire in their wake as they surged toward the approaching horrors. The combined fleet of humanity and the Vakari fought like a beast backed into a corner, lashing out with everything it had. Warships unleashed hell, railguns roaring as they launched hypervelocity slugs that could shatter asteroids. Energy. Lances carved through space, trying, desperately, to pin down an enemy that refused to be bound by the laws of physics. But the Eidolon were not like any adversary that had ever been faced before. They did not fight like fleets. They did not move like ships. They did not even react like living things. They twisted through the void in ways that defied understanding, shifting their forms mid-flight, vanishing for split seconds only to reappear somewhere else, closer, always, closer. A Vakari dreadnought, its hull reinforced with the finest warplating their empire had ever forged, fired its entire arsenal at an incoming cluster of shadows. The missiles struck first, their payloads detonating in massive blooms of nuclear fire. Then the railguns followed, rounds moving faster than thought. For a moment, it seemed to work. Then the darkness shuddered, folded, broke apart, and simply reformed around the detonations. And then, the dreadnought began to die. The Eidolon did not breach its hull. They did not board it like any conventional enemy would. Instead, the shadows seeped into the very structure of the ship, slipping through, reinforced plating as if it were mist. The Vakari warriors inside had barely enough time to react before their bodies folded inward, their armor crumpling, their screams turning into something wet and static-filled over the comms before cutting off completely. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, The great warship imploded. Not in fire, not in the usual catastrophic destruction of battle, but in silence, folding in on itself, warping into nothingness before it was simply gone. Admiral Rains watched it happen, his hands clenched so tightly behind his back that his knuckles went white. He had seen entire battle groups annihilated before, had watched planets burn, had commanded desperate retreats when there was no other option. But this was something else. A Vakari officer beside him let out a low, growling snarl. They are unmaking us. He wasn't wrong. And yet, despite everything, despite the horror unfolding around them, the fleet fought. Vakari battlecruisers, once the terror of humanity's colonies, now fought like enraged beasts, their weapons, systems overloading as they unleashed everything in their arsenals. They roared into the void, carving through enemy formations in suicidal charges that should not have been possible. Human destroyers wove between the larger vessels, moving like packs of wolves, tearing into the Eidolon with relentless pinpoint strikes. Ships died. Too many, and still, they fought. A voice crackled over the command channel, half static, half raw desperation. "We need an opening. We can't hold this line." Rains didn't hesitate. "Fall back to the second formation. Keep the flanks tight. Vakari, you see an opening, you take it. Hit them where it hurts." Varen Ka, standing beside him, did not respond with words. He simply turned and issued the order to his warriors in his own tongue. The Vakari forces adjusted immediately, their formations shifting with practiced efficiency, cutting through the chaos of battle with the kind of brutal, decisive action that had once made them conquerors. A human cruiser, its engines trailing. Fire spiraled out of control as an Eidolon form latched onto its hull. The thing twisted, rippled, and then burrowed into the metal itself. The ship screamed, its structure warping in ways that should not have been possible. And then, with a final, sickening shudder, it became something else. The human vessel's hull twisted into an unnatural, jagged shape, its engines flickering, with a dark, pulsing energy. And then, without warning, it turned its weapons against the fleet. Rains swore under his breath. "They're corrupting our ships." Varen Ka let out a deep, guttural growl. "Then we do not let them take any more." The Vakari warships moved like hammers of the gods, slamming into the transformed vessel with overwhelming force. Plasma lances burned through its corrupted hull, railguns shattered its twisted form, and within seconds it was reduced to nothing more than molten wreckage. But it was a warning. The Eidolon were not just destroying them, they were remaking them, and, if they lost this battle, it would not just be the end of humanity and the Vakari. It would be their assimilation into something else. Something far worse. The battle raged on, a symphony of destruction and defiance. The Allied fleet was losing, ships by the second, but they had no choice but to hold. If they fell here, there would be nothing left to stand between the Eidolon and the rest of the galaxy. And deep within the heart of the storm, a plan began to form. Not one of victory. That was impossible. But perhaps, one of survival. The void was ablaze with war. What had begun as a defensive stand had devolved into something far more desperate, something primal. The fleet no longer fought for victory. They fought to survive. Every second they remained in battle was another second stolen from oblivion, another heartbeat wrenched from the hands of an enemy that did not bleed, did not burn, did not die the way things were supposed to die. The Eidolon moved like nightmares given form, slipping through the carnage, feeding on destruction itself. Their numbers did not dwindle, no matter how many were torn apart by plasma or shredded by railgun fire. They would fall, flicker, reform. Each one that perished seemed to drag another from the unseen depths of space, as if the void itself was birthing them with every shot fired. Humanity's fleet had been reduced to barely a third of its original strength. The Vakari had fared only slightly better, their warships built for relentless brutality, their warriors refusing to retreat even as their hulls split open, as the darkness crept into their ships and stole them away. On the bridge of the Indomitable, Admiral Gideon Rains wiped blood from his temple, bracing himself against the flickering holodisplay. The ship rocked violently as something impacted its lower decks, but he forced himself to stay focused. "The line won't hold much longer," Commander Vega said, her voice ragged with exhaustion. "We're losing too many ships. The Eidolon—" She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "They're adapting to our tactics." Rains already knew. He had seen it happen. The Eidolon were studying them, learning them. The formations that had worked at the start of the battle were now liabilities. The attacks that had burned through the enemy's ranks now barely slowed them down. They were being hunted. Across the bridge, Vakari High Warlord Varan Ka loomed over a tactical display, his golden eyes fixed on the shifting battlefield. His mandibles tightened in frustration, his warplate streaked with burns and the blood of his own kind. The Vakari did not retreat. It was not in their nature. But this was not a battle they could win through sheer ferocity. "We are being funneled," Varan Ka rumbled, his voice low with fury. His clawed fingers traced the patterns of movement across the display. "The Eidolon are forcing us toward the planet." Rains frowned, scanning the tactical feed. Varan Ka was right. The swarm was maneuvering them, subtly, inevitably, guiding the remains of the fleet downward. If they kept fighting like this, they wouldn't just lose, they would be trapped. His mind raced, calculating, weighing their dwindling options. There was no path to victory here. That much was clear. But if they could not win, they could deny the enemy what it wanted. Rains took a slow breath, steadying himself, then turned to the bridge crew. His voice was sharp, commanding. "Prepare all remaining ships for a controlled descent to the planet's surface. We can't win this fight in orbit." Vega's head snapped toward him. "Sir, if we break formation—" "They're hurting us," Rains cut her off. "They want us to stay locked in space, where they can pick us apart. But if we force the battle into an atmosphere, their advantage could weaken." Varan Ka let out a low growl of understanding. "They do not move like ships. They swim through the void. If gravity, resistance, and atmospheric density interfere with their movement, they may lose their cohesion," Rains finished. "It wasn't a perfect plan. Hell, it wasn't even a good plan. But it was all they had." Rains turned to his comms officer. "Send the signal. Full retreat to the planet's surface. Any ship that can still fly, follow us down." The order was given. Across the battlefield, the surviving vessels of humanity and the Vakari twisted their vectors, engines flaring as they broke from combat and descended toward the scarred surface of New Horizon. The Eidolon did not react immediately. It was as if they did not understand what was happening, why their prey was no longer playing the game they had been forced into. But hesitation did not last long. The shadows followed. The descent was chaos. Ships plunged through the atmosphere at breakneck speeds, hulls burning from the friction, wounded vessels barely holding themselves together as they streaked toward the ruined world below. Some never made it. A Vakari battlecruiser, its engines failing, spun out of control and shattered against the mountains. A fireball that lit up the sky like a dying star. A human destroyer lost power mid-descent, vanishing into the endless black ocean that had swallowed half the planet. But most did make it. The remains of the fleet touched down in the ruins of New Horizon, engines screaming, hulls groaning as they settled into the broken earth. The moment they hit ground, soldiers disembarked, humans and Vakari alike, moving with practiced efficiency, securing defensive positions among the wreckage of a colony that had already been lost. Then, the sky darkened. The Eidolon were coming. Rains stood at the edge of the landing zone, his breath slow, steady, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. Around him, human marines and Vakari warriors prepared for what was to come. Plasma rifles powered up, kinetic weapons locked and loaded, energy blades humming in the hands of those who preferred steel over fire. Vega stood at his side, checking her rifle. "If this doesn't work, it will work," Rains said, his voice ironclad, "because it has to." Varan Ka stepped forward, drawing his warblade. The weapon gleamed in the dim light, its edge humming with deadly energy. "We fight here," he said, his voice carrying across the ranks of gathered warriors. "We hold this ground." He raised his blade, a silent challenge to the enemy above, "and we show them why we endure." Then, the first shadow touched the ground. It did not land. It simply arrived, twisting out of the air like something being born into reality. It loomed, its shape flickering, shifting, bending impossibly, something not meant to exist in a world of gravity and matter. And then, with an ear-piercing shriek, the battle for New Horizon began. The Eidolons surged forward, no longer confined by the physics of space, but still as deadly, still as unknowable. They came in waves, impossible, silent things, crawling over the ruins, slipping between broken buildings like living nightmares. The first Vakari warriors met them head-on, their war cries shaking the ground as they charged into the abyss. Human soldiers opened fire, their weapons cutting through the gloom, tracers burning against the dark. And for the first time in history, humanity and the Vakari stood together, not as enemies, but as brothers in arms. A new war had begun. One they had to win, or else the galaxy would belong to the darkness forever.